Hello everyone, my name is Maiwand Banayee and I am the author of Delusions of Paradise, Escaping the Life of a Taliban Fighter. This book basically details my journey from a young Afghan refugee who once embraced the ideal of jihad and martyrdom to becoming a physiotherapist and an author and an advocate for critical thinking. As much as Delusion of Paradise tells my personal story, it also showed the reader the larger geopolitical landscape that pushed Afghanistan into the hands of political Islam. My story began with I, but it is not really about me. It is about how vulnerable young people can be indoctrinated into destructive ideologies of jihadism and martyrdom, and how education, critical thinking, and exposure to new ideas and perspective can change the course of a life. To understand my journey, we must first understand the Afghanistan that existed before decades of war transformed it. Now, this is Afghanistan before the war. Afghanistan of 1950s and 70s. This is Afghanistan during what many people would call it its golden age. Kabul was known as the Paris of Central Asia. It was a cosmopolitan city visited by tourists from Europe and America. Young people shopped in record stores, attended cinemas, and studied at co-educational schools. Unlike today, women were not imprisoned in their houses. Women worked, attended university, wore modern clothing, and participated fully in public life. Even in rural Afghanistan, although people were conservative, religion was generally cultural rather than political. Men and women worked together in agriculture, and they performed the traditional Afghan dance of Atan at celebration. This was probably the Afghanistan many of my parents' generation knew, but that Afghanistan would soon disappear. Things began to fall apart when the Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union tried to implement radical changes by imposing a socialist system on a relatively poor country. These changes did not resonate with the Afghan population, leading many to rebel against the Soviet-backed government. Then the Russians bombed large part of rural Afghanistan, killing men, women, children, and livestock. And then this conflict would create 7 million Afghan refugees. Most refugees fled to Pakistan across harsh mountainous terrain, traveling for days on foot or on donkeys and on mules, and where the United States and Gulf states built sprawling mud and tent refugee camps for them. And this would ignite a Cold War between Russia and America, and Afghanistan would become their battleground. Then the Americans wanted to prevent the Soviet drive toward the Persian Gulf, and they needed political Islam to act as a barrier against Russia's advancement. During this period, the Americans brought political Islam to life to act as a barrier against the spread of communism by creating mujahideen or holy warriors. As it can be seen in this video, Brzezinski, a CIA officer, is motivating Afghans to fight for their country and their religion.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as long as possible.
And then around that time, the United States Agency for International Development gave millions to the University of Nebraska to develop educational materials for Afghan refugees children, to inoculate them with the Islamic ideology and encourage them to participate in jihad against the Russians by becoming mujahid or mujahideen. Through this curriculum, children as young as 4 and 5 learned jihad along the alphabet. A was for Ahmad, J was for jihad, G was for gun. Then they were asked to make a sentence such as, Ahmad performed jihad with his gun and kills infidel. The only schools available in those refugee camps were madrasa and jihadi school. Instead of teaching them how to live, they were teaching them how to die and how to become mujahid or mujahideen. Okay, in the meantime, Afghan jihad also gave rise to the system of madrasa or religious seminary. Prior to Soviet invasion, there were only a couple of madrasas or Islamic religious seminary in entire Afghanistan. Only a small number of boys would attend madrasas, becoming Taliban students or seekers of knowledge. Taliban means seekers of knowledge, and later returned to their villages as local imam. At that time, the Taliban never had reputation for masculinity. They were rather known for their chastity and innocence. Afghan Pashto folklore songs romanticized the Taliban, and women made jokes about them. However, it was during the anti-Soviet war that the germ of political Islam grew among Afghan refugees living along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Steve Cole writes in Ghost Wars in his book that there were around only 900 madrasas along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border in 1971. However, by the time the Russians were leaving, the number had mushroomed to 35,000 madrasas religious seminary. Many of these madrasas were funded by wealthy donors from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. For many refugee children, these institutions became their only source of education, producing activists, Islamists, jihadists, and mujahideen. People seeking the establishment of Sharia and aspiring to martyrdom. This culture of jihad and martyrdom would ruin the future of Afghanistan for generations to come. So not only madrasa, Afghan jihad also gave birth to global jihad or globalization of jihad. Then the West marketed the Afghan jihad to the entire globe. Hollywood made movies depicting the Mujahideen as selfless freedom fighters. Afghan jihadi leaders were invited to evangelical churches in America. Then the American and Islamists were united against the godless communists. This would make Afghanistan an iconic land of jihad and miracle, attracting nearly 35,000 foreign fighters, including Osama bin Laden and his allies as shown in this picture. The same Osama bin Laden who will later be labeled as Al-Qaeda member. I believe that had it not been for the Afghan jihad, perhaps September 11 might have never happened. Nevertheless, Afghanistan would pay the highest price. Many of these Soviet soldiers were young and untested on the battlefield. They found Afghanistan mountainous climate and terrain and guerrilla warfare extremely difficult. Some became hooked on hashish and heroin. Most of these Russian draftees were brought to Afghanistan under the promise that they would help Afghans, but they saw a different reality. When they questioned their superiors, they were told it is what America did in Vietnam, killing whomever they got their hands on. Some even became disillusioned with the war. When they could not capture a village, they would ask for air cover, and then the planes would bomb the entire village. In the meantime, the Mujahideen were highly motivated by religious conviction and the dream of a blessed afterlife. And then when the American gave Stinger missile to Mujahideen to shoot the Russian planes, the tide turned against the Russian. After nearly 9 years of war, around 1 million Afghan and 15,000 Soviet troops had been killed. The Soviet Union subsequently withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. However, the Afghan government continued to resist the Mujahideen for the next 3 years. By 1991, I was about 11 years old. The Soviet-backed communist regime was on the verge of collapse, while the American-backed Islamists, the Mujahideen, were on the cusp of taking power. Every day, coffins arrived on the back of pickup trucks from the front line. Poverty and fear of Mujahideen takeover filled everyone's imaginations. The Mujahideen had blocked the food supply routes to Kabul. In the meantime, famine was raging in Kabul because food supply had been disrupted. To avoid starvation, the government began subsidizing local bakeries to distribute large flat naans to families. My mother would send me and my sister to collect bread several times. We queued from morning until lunchtime, only to return home empty-handed. I vividly remember those days. The roads teemed with beggars, and children died of starvation. As the government weakened, Afghanistan stood at the edge of yet another collapse. So by 1992, I was about 12 years old. When the sun peeked from behind the blue-gray mountains, a new world was born before our eyes. Thousands of bearded and long-haired Mujahideen fighters swarmed into Kabul from every direction, riding pickup trucks and abandoned Soviet tanks decorated with roses and banners. They waved fire into the air and chanted Allahu Akbar. Once the Soviet-backed government collapsed, people hoped for peace. However, Mujahideen began looting Kabul. And then the Mujahideen turned their guns on each other. Afghanistan descended into a severe and bloody civil war. I remained stranded in the midst of that conflict for more than 2.5 years, where I witnessed both the best and the worst of humanity. The horrors I witnessed during those years are things no child should ever have to see. Bullets hissed over our house. Rockets swept across the sky, roaring like thunder. Every nearby explosion sent tremor to my heart. No child should ever have to experience what Kabul endured during those years. And I have captured all those wars in my book, Delusions of Paradise. By the winter of 1994, Kabul had become a derelict and deserted city, as though it had been struck by an Armageddon. Bombardment, looting, kidnapping, and arbitrary arrests had become part of daily life. The violence seemed endless. Tribe fought tribe, warlord fought warlord, neighbor fought neighbor. Authority had collapsed everywhere. Armed groups controlled different roads, demanding illegal tools, kidnapping people and abusing civilians. The situation worsened when the sky turned its back on us, not delivering a single drop of rain, ruining the harvest once again. Food became scarce and people fled in every direction. Some escaped to the safer part of Afghanistan, and some fled to the border of Iran and Pakistan. While Afghanistan was bleeding, the world watched. America had packed its bags after defeating communism with Afghan blood. The United Nations seemed powerless. Meanwhile, Pakistan, Iran, India, and Saudi Arabia continued backing their preferred factions. Then we heard that a new group of fighters were emerging out of madrasas, seminaries, who would bring justice, security, and put an end to the warlord rules. Stories spread that Taliban fighters were a mythical force for good who had rescued kidnapped children and punished abusive commanders. For many Afghans, including myself, they appeared to be a force for justice. As the Taliban were making their debut in 1994, I fled the war and arrived in Shamshatur refugee camp in Pakistan. It was a world completely different from Kabul. The camp was infused with intense religious culture. By then, the Russia had been defeated. However, the refugees living in those mad camps were still drunk with euphoria of their victory, seeing a divine hand. Its inhabitants had more in common with 7th century Saudi Arabia than with their own era. So now this Shamshatur refugee camp was one of the 150 refugee camps that had been built for 3 million Afghan refugees. The refugees who had fled Afghanistan called themselves Muhajirun, and their migration was described as Hijra, mirroring the Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. In that small and insular world, everyone tried to emulate how the Prophet Muhammad and his companion were believed to have lived. Martyrs were lionized, suicide bombers were celebrated as heroes. The only schools available were madrasas, where I walked into an ideological echo chambers of the past. In the madrasa, I was taught that Muslims were superior to non-Muslims, that apostates should be killed, that democracy was against Islam, and that Islam should dominate the world. They said that it was every Muslim obligation to establish Sharia, God's laws on God's earth. To bring about Sharia, we needed jihad, armed struggle, even at the expense of our own lives. If we were to achieve martyrdom, we were told that it would be the greatest honor imaginable. Paradise would be granted with the first drop of blood. These ideas were reinforced through selected Quranic verses and stories that glorified martyrdom. Nor did I learn about these ideas in the madrasa. The mythology surrounding martyrs would be here in the streets, mosques, and homes of the refugee camps. People said stories of the martyred whose body never decayed. Others claimed that martyrs had risen from the dead or that animals refused to touch their body. I also attended jihadi conferences where the West was portrayed as cruel, savage, and inhuman. Images from Palestine, Lebanon, and other conflicts were shown repeatedly to fuel anger and reinforce the belief that Muslims were under constant attack. When you are living in an environment riddled with abject poverty, no woman, and constant sexual repressions, you are only left at the mercy of your imagination. You say to yourself, if you can't have it, you might be able to have it somewhere else. That's in the afterlife. After living in that environment for more than a year, I fell for many of those myths and narratives. Then my greatest desire in life became to participate in jihad and attain martyrdom. The Taliban entered Kabul and drove off the warlords. And that was 1996. Like many Afghans, exhausted by years of civil war, I saw the Taliban as the agent of peace and justice. With the Taliban in charge, all the warlord, gangster, thieves, rapists, and stiff-necked, the big, the bad, and the ugly disappeared from Kabul. There was no more looting, no more rocket attacks, and no more kidnapping. Inspired by dream of jihad and martyrdom, now I wanted to put all those fantasies into reality. I traveled to Kabul and joined the Taliban. However, the Taliban were also fascists. Their draconian law was medieval and barbaric. All men had to grow their beards longer than hand grips, or else they put them in prison until their beard grew to the Islamic length. Women were all banned from the public life. They had to veil themselves and have a male guardian to step into the street. The Taliban were also against the furniture and all type of entertainment. Their government reflected the same culture I had experienced in the refugee camps. Music was banned. Women were excluded from much of the public life. Free speech did not exist. Public flogging and execution were common, yet many Afghans tolerated these restrictions. because at least the Taliban restored order after 5 years of bloody civil war. In Delusion of Paradise, I describe how the Taliban operated in the event that eventually shattered my faith in them. And then in 2001, the September 11 came. That would change the world. 2 days after 9/11, President Bush lashed out on television, "This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while. Every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." The United States blamed Osama bin Laden, whom the Taliban had sheltered. This was the same Osama that once the Americans supported. Unfortunately, America and their allies Saudi Arabia and Pakistan had fostered this intense culture of jihad and martyrdom, giving little thoughts to the future of its prospects. However, the Taliban leader Mullah Omar refused to hand him over. According to the reports at that time, he argued that Pashtun tradition required him to protect the guests who had sought shelter. And then October 7, America and Britain began dropping iron and fire into Afghanistan. Now the most sophisticated, the most powerful, and technologically equipped nation were caught in war with the most poorest, war-ravaged, and backward country in the world. Boots fought sandals, helmets fought turbans, reality fought myth. Then by December 2001, the Taliban government had collapsed. Many of its members were captured and brutally killed, while many Taliban and Al-Qaeda members escaped into Pakistan or remote mountainous regions such as Tora Bora, finding a safe haven under the protection of the Pakistan army, and yet to begin another protracted war. All this time when the Taliban were hiding in every foxhole, in Kabul, the Northern Alliances greeted the International Security Assistance Forces ISAF with flowers and garlands. The warlords of various factions reappeared in Kabul. Some became ministers, while others were hailed as heroes, forming a government characterized by widespread corruption and deep ethnic rivalries. Now the same country that had been used as a battlefield during the Cold War became the front line of war on terrorism. For the next 20 years, Afghanistan remained at the center of international conflict. Trillions of dollars were spent, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, schools were built, roads were reconstructed, millions of girls returned to education, yet beneath the surface, many of the deeper ideological and political problems remain unresolved. The Taliban regrouped across the border, finding safe haven in Pakistan, and gradually rebuilt their strength. The war dragged on, year after year. Many Afghans hoped that peace would eventually come, but the peace never came. 400,000 of civilian Afghans died. More than 70,000 Afghan security personnel were killed. 3,600 coalition troops lost their life. After 20 years, the Americans had enough and they began packing their bag. And then after 20 years, the longest war in American history came to an end. In 2021, the United States and its allies withdrew from Afghanistan. And with their withdrawal, Afghanistan government collapsed with astonishing speed. Province after province fell. Then Kabul fell, leaving behind its allies. The Taliban returned to power almost exactly 20 years after they had been removed. For many people around the world, this was shocking. But for those of us who had lived through Afghanistan history, the warning signs had been there for many years. Military power can defeat an army, but it cannot easily defeat an ideology. The Taliban had lost control of the government in 2001, but the same ideology that had created that movement survived and remote villages, in refugee camps, and in madrasas and religious schools. The same movement that had ruled Afghanistan in 1990s was once again in control. America came after one Osama bin Laden and left behind a radicalized nation. Now the Taliban had taken power again and have implemented their Sharia based on the Quran and saying of Prophet Muhammad. Women are living in a system of gender apartheid under an oppressive regime that does not see them as fully human. Girls are barred from education beyond 6th grade. And they have even placed ban on their voices. The number of madrasas, Islamic seminaries, is increasing fourfold. 9 million kids are attending madrasas to become Islamists and then jihadis. All types of entertainment are banned. Afghanistan is back in the Middle Ages. Public flogging and punishment are back in display. These two pictures are taken almost 50 or 60 years apart. They tell the tragic story of Afghanistan. One shows an Afghanistan where women attended universities, work in professional career, and participate in public life. The other shows an Afghanistan where women have been pushed out of education, employment, and many areas of society. This didn't happen overnight. Afghanistan did not simply woke up one morning under radical Islam. It was the results of decades of war, foreign interference, poverty, displacement, and ideological indoctrinations. Had Karl Marx never came up with the idea of communism, had Russia not invaded Afghanistan, and had America, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia not bolstered the culture of jihad and martyrdom to indoctrinate Afghan youth against Russia, we would have not been there. Today, millions of children in Afghanistan are growing under similar conditions that I grew up. Now, when I look back on that young man and the ignorance, delusion, and false narrative he took as truth, I feel empathy for the boy that I was, and I shudder with fear for today's generation of young men and women who are once again living under the Taliban harsh rules and are being brainwashed into destructive ideologies of jihadism and martyrdom. Had certainly it not happened, I could have easily remained a Taliban fighter. I could have died pursuing martyrdom. Instead, I began questioning the ideas I had been taught. I learned that the opposite of extremism is not another ideology. It is critical thinking. It is education. It is curiosity. My story began with I, but it is not really about me. It is about how vulnerable human beings can be shaped by the stories they inherit. If my journey can teach us anything, it is that people are not born extremists. They are made. And if they can be made, they can also change. Thank you for listening. And for those of you interested in a full story, it is told in my memoir, Delusion of Paradise, Escaping the Life of a Taliban Fighter. Thank you again.